When I was a little younger, about 8 to 10 years ago, something completely unexplainable happened to me. I don't tell this story to anyone, mostly because up until earlier today even I thought it wasn't real. I'm not sure what to do about it, or if there is anything I could do, so I thought to post here, maybe at least just to ease my head and hear what others think. Around high school time, I was a loser and complete shut-in. Most of my time during these formative teenage years, I'd just spend inside, playing games or listening to music and spacing out. Though I've always had a fond interest with photography, capturing life through brief screenshots is precious, plus it's fun and easy to do with just the average phone. So, occasionally, I would leave on my own to wander the woods at the end of our street. Gave me plenty of time alone to get fresh air and stretch, as well as snap a bunch of pictures of mostly bugs, but other animals or plants I found pretty too. On one of these walks, I heard a very off-putting sound. It vibrated very quietly along the trees and in the surrounding area. Whilst I'm normally a very paranoid person, and I was certainly uneased by the presence of this noise, I thought I recognized it. From the distance I was to whatever was producing it, the sound vaguely resembled that of a pig. My thought was maybe some livestock had escaped from a nearby farm or something. Whether I was right or not, it sounded hurt. The slow agonized rattle, piercing the odd bird chirp or rustle of a branch falling. Then, I made a decision that would scar my life forever. I approached. If it was hurt, I wasn't just going to leave it to bleed to death or whatever. I know, circle of life and all that, but I was young and much dumber than I am now. I made a brief trek off the path to find the source of the noise and hopefully, save it. Wading through a bramble bush that slightly cut my legs, I began to focus on the sound. Or rather, the sound seemingly gave me no choice but to focus on it. No birds were chirping anymore, and aside from my movements, the rising repetitive groans were all I could hear. Everything from the leaves in the trees to the soft blowing winds fell still. Something felt off, and in my stomach, I had a strong rising urge to turn back. But I didn't. The sound grew closer and I hadn't ventured too far from the path. It wasn't deafening by any means, but the sound punched through the silence with now a twinge of desperation, like I needed to find it. Up until this very moment, I have never forgotten what I saw. In a ditch, just like any other, surrounded by trees and leaf litter but completely devoid of life. Something indescribable. The closest resemblance I could give you is it was similar in shape and size to whale carcasses that wash ashore. A messy pile of color and rotting substances. Except there were so many materials, so many different textures I simply couldn't identify. There was no discernible body shape or figure. It merely looked as if you had fused together parts of every animal alive and draped a cloth over top of the result. It was warping constantly. I couldn't quite wrap my head around it. I simply couldn't understand what this was. What confused me the most was the smell, or rather, lack of one. The environment smelt just fine, the leaves an earthy natural scent, as if this thing in front of me wasn't even there. My heart began to thump a little. I'd never seen a dead body in person, obviously, so I had no clue if I was stumbling upon something I wasn't supposed to see. This wasn't what I was looking for, and the groaning sound was pulsating from it. On edge, the slightest sounds began to feel like spears of anxiety cutting straight through my chest. I fell back a little, caught myself, and ran back to the path. No one was around, so I didn't care about keeping my composure, and I ran until I caught sight of home again. My mother was home and noticed me sweaty, shaky, and on edge. "Home already? Your walks normally last a while longer," she inquired, with a very minor tone of concern. Yeah, just got a bit tired," I explained, as I still hadn't fully come to terms with what I'd seen and didn't feel that anyone in my family would think anything of it other than that I was losing my mind. She told me that food was being prepared and wouldn't be very long, but I returned to my room swiftly and collapsed face first onto my bed. I pondered for a while over what it could have been and came to the conclusion of an art project. It had no scent, so perhaps it was a sculpt with sound effects for a film. The indescribable mass being man-made brought me enough comfort to slow my heart rate for the time. For a brief duration, nothing else happened. I refused to return to the woods for a while, so I had no more encounters with whatever it was, purely so that I could continue to convince myself that it was nothing more than a creative pursuit. That didn't last for very long, though. Cozy and warm in bed, I was scrolling my phone absent-mindedly. I hadn't thought about the thing all day as I had spent it hanging out with friends outside of school. The slight buzz of my bedside lamp, the busyness of the kitchen downstairs, the slow creeping ringing in my ears as everything fell silent. Then that haunting, slow rasping seeping under the crack of my door. The drawn-out groan pushed its way into my room, my only safe place. I could listen to nothing else. I could think of nothing else as I watched a shadow slowly stretch along the floor, invading the dim light. My eyes grew wide and fearful. I clutched my phone as if it was my last hope, and I shuffled out of bed to avoid being caught off guard. If I needed to run, I could run. The doorknob turned, muted by the great, harrowing moans. The door creaked open, drowned out still by the desperate sounds of that nightmarish sight. The doorway opened, giving way to a strange light. It flooded my room as if bright, yet pervasively infected each corner of my vision with darkness. In a swift, jarring movement, a mass stretched out from behind the obscurant surface, like skin being pulled from someone's body to create the mockery of a head. It had the same damn warping textures as the thing I found in the woods. It had no other features, and was merely a protruding clump of moving substances. Except, somewhere within the shifting motion, I could pick out a face, one with a deep haunting gaze. It was as if its eyelids had been peeled back and fused into the skin above and below its eye sockets, unprotected orbs that only stared and stared. Similarly, deep holes, where the nose had been pushed back into its head and once again, fused into its undefined formless mass. It had no mouth. All it could do was emit muffled cries as it stretched and quivered in place. I blinked. "Hun, we're going out for a little to get some shopping done. We'll be back soon. Love you," my mother called out as I watched her slip back through the door. That vision, that thing had vanished instantly, but its presence remained. A few days later, I had calmed down once again, thinking I must have hallucinated from a lack of sleep after panicking over the thing I'd seen. The bell rung for the 6th time in the day and I headed to art class. I sat by my friend Alex with a slight uneasy shiver in my body. I tried to brush it off and we joked a little in murmurs as the teacher rambled on. Toward the end of the subject, as we were doing practical work in the form of paintings, when the bell rang a little earlier than I'd expected, I turned my face to see how everyone else was responding to it. They'd all turned to me too, blank, staring faces. Even Alex, even the teacher, everyone. In an immediate fit of panic, I jolted out of my seat, slamming my knees on the desk. I winced in pain, but still, their eyes followed me perfectly. I shuffled past people, wobbling a little from hurting my knees, and bolted out of the classroom. Things just kept happening and I didn't know why. Through the hallways, that growing darkness began to appear before I burst out into the courtyard. There, a slow rattling groan awoken in my ears again. I was becoming extremely familiar and recognized it immediately. Tears began to roll out of my eyes as I screamed, trying to drown out the sound, but it didn't work. It grew louder and louder, deafening my surroundings. I opened my eyes wide again to see a huge, limp mass in front of me, shapeless and constantly contorting. It had no identifiable features beyond the shifting unknown textures and colors. Taller than it was wide, I tried to see where a head should be on a human, but once again, just a repulsive slurry that I couldn't understand. But it was looking at me. It was looking at me, watching, staring, observing. Anywhere I moved I could not hide. The sound began to hurt, the pulsing, rising groan of misery that pained me. I screamed once more, clutching my head. Alex grabbed my arm violently. "Hey?" he questioned worriedly. I let go of myself and looked up. My classmates all turned to look at me, but no longer staring. They were whispering amongst themselves. Then the bell rang and the teacher awkwardly hurried to move everyone out. I looked back down shakily, very faint blood stains where I had clasped my ears, and everything felt a little quieter. Alex offered to take me to the medical office, and I was far too exhausted to refuse. He had to return to classes after the break, but I was too shaken up to even speak, so they let me stay a little longer and I was sent home shortly after. I went home and stayed quiet. I was drained. I lay there, appreciating the precious silence of my room. School had just finished, and I received a text from my friends. We shortly arranged to go on a walk together through the woods to help me feel better. I wanted to show them what I'd been seeing. Though my parents were hesitant, they allowed it since my friends, Alex and May, would be there. They arrived, and we set off toward the woods, but I directed them to the specific section I had ran out from. I didn't want to be out here longer than I needed to be. We arrived at the spot, but the sounds weren't there anymore. Maybe it was because of my slightly dulled hearing, but there was nothing. Desperate to convince myself I was still sane, I hurried them off the path. "No, there's something here you need to see," I began, immediately turning and stumbling in the direction of where I'd seen it. Alex was less hesitant than May, but both eventually followed. "If you say so, what is it anyway?" Alex asked. "I don't know," is all I could respond with. He turned to May with confusion, who anxiously shrugged back. I stepped over the bramble bush again, making sure not to cut myself on it like before. Still, nothing. The ditch was there. There was a clear indication that something had filled this space due to the unnatural scatter of leaves around it, but it just wasn't there. It was here before," I cried out. As much as it freaked me out, I was hoping for any sign that I was overreacting. "The leaves, the trees, what are we looking at here?" Alex chipped in. I turned to him with a dreary hopelessness. His expression fell a little. "Why don't we just head back onto the trail for now?" May called. I gave in, slowly returning to the path. Since it wasn't there, maybe I had nothing to fear traveling through the woods again. But there it was, the distant, faint sound of a hurt animal groaning in slow, painful misery. "You guys hear that?" Alex commented. Immediately I snapped with fear. Yes, I didn't know what to do. My legs began to shake again and my vision was blurring as the sound grew closer, but we weren't moving this time. I ran. I couldn't help myself. I think Alex or May called out to me just before I did, but I couldn't stop. The further I ran, the sound never faded, but it never grew. Only when I reached my home did it disappear. I ripped open the door, slammed it shut, and ran straight up to my room. I didn't wait to take my shoes off or hear what my mother had to say. I buried myself in my pillow and cried. Later that night, they both texted in our group chat, frustrated that I pulled a weird prank like that, expressing how worried and concerned they were. I stopped going to school for the rest of the week as my ears had both become infected and hard to hear out of. It was irritating as hell, so I was more than happy to lay in bed all day. This last part is a little hazy to me due to the actions I took at the end. Most of this is missing details, but this night specifically, I have desperately tried to block out of my memory. It wasn't until recently it came back to me in pieces. I remember my whole family was out for various reasons. My parents were both working late shifts and my sister was having a sleepover at her friend's. I was especially anxious already because of my situation, so I crawled out of bed and clumsily headed downstairs. I poured a very shallow bowl of cereal when that familiar sound kicked up again. I was taking absolutely no chances, dropping the bowl on the counter and rushing to lock everything I could. Every single door, every single window, up until the very last one. I turned, jittery and terrified. Something was there. The front room's secondary window, a smaller, more ornate patterned window compared to the large glass pane in the center of the wall. Through the textured glass I saw it. I was face to face with an angel. A stretched, warping face with the familiar peeled eyes and nose. We locked eyes and it immediately slipped away unnaturally. I could hear nothing, but I locked the window as fast as possible and nearly tripped skidding back to the stairs. The sound grew louder yet again, louder than it had been, making my ears burn with searing agony. Nowhere was safe. I hadn't locked this thing out. I had caged myself in for it. My panic grew as my heart beat faster. I rushed into the bathroom as I heard the door downstairs very slowly creaking open without the slightest resistance from the locks. I ripped open the medicine cabinet and darted back to my room with sleeping pills in hand. I knew this was it for me. I had an unexplainable feeling, just as indescribable as the formless carcass that was coming for me. I didn't want to be there when it happened. Last I remember, I finally smelt it approaching, a hideous mesh of ash and rotten meat. The smell permeated my room as my eyes began to shudder. I could feel the physical pain of them kicking in. I was already exhausted, and I don't know if I fell asleep quickly or if I just blocked out most of before I did. I awoke a week later. My parents were in tears, wondering why I'd ever try to take my own life and wishing that I'd spoken to them. For 10 long years, my story has ended there, a crazy drug trip from trying to take my own life. Just yesterday I checked my phone's old storage to see what was on there, and I saw a video I didn't recognize. It was dark blue and grainy. A few minutes in, however, a door in the background opens. Light flickers in, illuminating me, asleep. 20 long minutes follow. 20 long minutes of raspy death rattles and the cold, lifeless stare of the corpse of an angel watching over me.